This is the last in our series of videos about creating an N-tier application. In this video, we're going to talk about stored procedures. Stored procedures are a very important concept, and typically when we're writing code, we're not going to be actually writing the SQL code. We're going to be writing stored procedures instead. In case you don't know, a stored procedure is a set of SQL statements that you can execute as if it were one particular single unit. And typically what people do is they use stored procedures to access the database because the database administrator sets up these stored procedures. That way the programmer on this side doesn't need to know how the database itself is structured. So if the database admin changes the database, they only have to change the stored procedure. So it further isolates changes so that it's pretty easy, so I don't have to recompile my code every time somebody changes the database on me. So stored procedures improve performance because they're sort of compiled code as opposed to interpreted code. And like I said, they hide implementation details, so it becomes very easy to use stored procedures. We're going to use stored procedures to solve a particular problem that we have. Well, we don't have it right now, but one that we could create with the database. So right now everything works just fine, but if you remember over here we use something called myFakeID to determine what the user ID was in the data set. So here we have a data row and it basically comes from this myFakeID, which doesn't directly relate to the ID in the database itself. So what we want to do is we want to figure out how this, what we want to do is we want to show you that this can cause problems. It won't cause problems as it is right now. That's because we've only updated once at form closing, and so it doesn't matter to us whether the fake ID and the real ID are the same thing. But suppose we want to update more frequently. Is that going to cause us a problem? As you can probably imagine, the answer is yes. So for example, suppose I do this. So I say user ID dot update right now, or user db dot update, and I do the same thing after the add, and I do the same thing after the change. And we'll see how this causes us problems. So now when I start the program up, okay, so I have particular records in the program, and now let me just add a record to the end here, ZZZ, ZZZZ, okay, and I'm going to add the record to the end, accept and exit from the program. And then I want to delete that last record, and the reason why I want to delete the record is to make it so that the new records that I add are not going to have the fake ID and the real ID are going to be different. Okay, so if I add a record up here, let's say new at new.com, and this will be new, and now I accept this. Now, because I've updated the database, in the database, new.com will have an ID of 5, but the fake ID will be 4. This causes us trouble if we want to update new.com. So suppose we wanted new.com to be new.edu, and we accept things. Now it'll actually blow things up, but the type of exception that we get will be a concurrency violation. Now we might think that concurrency violation has something to do with one or more users trying to access the same record at the same time, but in this case it's a result of the record in my data set not having the same ID as the record in my database. So the question, I'm sure, that's running through your mind is, how can I fix it? And you probably can imagine with a stored procedure. That's what this is all about, right? Okay, so I'm going to go up to the database and I'm going to refresh the database. It's always nice to refresh the database. And I'm going to create a new stored procedure. The way I created a stored procedure is I just go down here, right-click on stored procedure, choose Add New Stored Procedure, and it goes out and it creates a stored procedure for me. Then I change the procedure name here to a more meaningful name. So let's say I'm going to say insert user is what I'm going to call it. And I want to use the same SQL statement that I used over here. So I want to use, why? Because I know this works, okay? And if I try to invent a new one, I could make typos and everything is wrong. So I go in and I copy this constant string insert. So I copy the details of this over to my stored procedure. So this is what the stored procedure will be, and we'll run into problems, mainly because it doesn't know what email is and it doesn't know what name is. So we're going to have to define those two parameters. So we're going to define email. We'll just copy and we'll paste this in. And this will be as, will just be ncar. Okay, and then we will take name and we'll put that in here, and this will be ncar as well. All right, so now this is a stored procedure that works. However, it doesn't do, I mean, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get it to return the identity to us. So I'm going to have another parameter, and I'm going to call this the ID parameter, and this is going to be int, and it's also coming out of here, so it will be out as well. And then over here, what I want to do is I want to say set at ID equal to scope identity. Scope identity is a method, and I have very important, it's a method, so I have to put on those parentheses on the end. So it's a method that will return to me the identity of the record that I added using this insert. So it's very useful, very powerful method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do update, so that I update my stored procedure, and it will prepare a script for me. I will say update the database, and I'll be sure that I have a check over here, green check, and it says update completed successfully. So I know that this works. I can get rid of this right now. I can always go over here, and if I refresh my database again, I can see that insert user is one of the stored procedures, and I can add lots more stored procedures if I want to, but I'm only trying to solve one problem right now, and that's what I want to do. Okay, so now I don't need this anymore. I don't need the SQL statement here anymore, right? Because the SQL statement's over in my stored procedure, and I just need to have my stored procedure, which is called insert user. Now, what I have to do is I have to tell it that this insert command is not trying to execute a SQL statement, it's trying to execute a stored procedure. And the way that I do this is I go down to after I've defined insert command, and I type in insert command, and then I want to say what the command type of this is, and that equals command type dot stored procedure. So this tells me that what we're trying to execute here is the stored procedure. And now remember that we had email and we had name, but we have one more that we have to put in, and that's ID, right? And so what we want to do is we want to say insert command dot parameters dot add with value, and then the name is at ID, and that's going to be a SQL DB type dot int, and the source column for this is going to be ID. So what it's going to do is it will return this ID and put the ID in the source column. Pretty cool, huh? All right, so the next thing I need to do, one more thing I have to do, is these are input parameters. This is an output parameter. Every output parameter I have to tell the C# that indeed this is a output parameter. So the way that I do this is I have insert command parameters, and then I use ID, add ID, and I tell it that the I tell it that the direction of it is going to be equal to parameter direction dot output. Okay. So I say, okay, well, ID is coming out of here, and it's going to be output. So I have to tell it that it's going to be output. So it'll take whatever gets passed into ID and put into this field. So let's see what happens when we do this. I'm going to put a breakpoint right now in update so that we can see what's going on. So I do the start again, and I want to add a new record. Now, did I add any records? No. So I add a new record. I'm going to be calling this new at new.com, and it's going, oh, I'm sorry. First thing I'm going to do is, because I've updated the database, it actually got copied out and it wiped out all the changes, so I'm going to clear this out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add that ZZZZ record, ZZZ, just accept that in to the field, and then I'm going to go in again, and this time take Z and delete it out of there. Okay, so now it will get deleted out. Okay, now finally what's going to happen is I'm going to add a new record called new at new.new, and I'm going to change the name to new. Now let's look what happens when I do accept. Okay, we come down to here and it updates our data set. So we will say F11 so that it will update our data set. And now we want to look at particular things in our data set. Okay, so in particular, I want to look at what's the value of data table. So I'm going to highlight data table, go up here to the debug mode, and do a quick watch on data table. I'm not really interested in data table. I'm interested in data table.rows, and I'm not and I'm not interested in any data table.row. I'm looking at the third row. Okay, so let's reevaluate the third row. And let's look in our data set. Okay, we have new at new.new, new, and look, instead of having 4 in there, which is what we would have expected from our using our fake ID, it has the real ID in here, which is 5. So everything looks just fine, doesn't it? Well, not completely. Okay, let's look and see. Let's continue and see what's going to happen, because just because things worked out the way we wanted them to work out doesn't mean that it for sure is going to work out all the time. So here I'm going to go out to new at new.new, and I'm going to change this to new.com, and I'm going to say accept, and it's going to blow up on me. Okay, why did it blow up? It blew up because there was a null reference that was unhandled. Now, I might wonder, like, why is this null reference unhandled? And it's because the my user ID is still 4. So even though it's been changed in the data table, it's not been changed in our combo box. So we have to read things in and change things in our combo box once we've updated after an add. So let's see how we're going to do that. So one of the things we notice here is that we have this little method here, and what this little method goes through and does is it takes the information in user table.rows, and it uses it to build up a list. And so we're going to take that, we're going to copy that over, we're going to create a brand new method. This is only going to be we're going to need this to be public. So this is going to be called public static, and we're going to this is going to be a void method, and we're going to call it fill from table, and it will have in it, in fill from table, we will just have a list of a user, and we'll call this list user, and we'll call this my user list. Okay, and then we will put in here something that will fill this up, fill up this list from our data table. Okay, so this will take our data table and fill up my user list based on that. So we just copied that down. Now in the long term we want to refactor this and not have duplicate code, but for right now we just want to be sure that this is going to work before we go about refactoring anything. So number one, get things to work. Number two, get things to work nicely. Okay, so let's see what happens here. Okay, and so once we have updated this, what we want to do is we want to have user, okay, so the first thing we need to do is we have a, we want to define a list called my user list. We want this to be a new, this is a list of user, right? And we want that to be equal to a new list of user. Okay. Then what we want to do is we want to use userdb, just what we just had, fill from table, and we want to fill my user list from the table. Okay. Once we have that there, Then what we can do is we can clear out this combo box. And then finally, we can take my user list, and so we can say for each user U in my user list, we want to then add that to the email combo box. So email combo box dot items dot add, and we're going to add U in there. Okay, so this will now mean that all of these users will have the correct user ID. Okay, so I'm going to put a breakpoint here just so that we're sure that we end up with the right user ID. So we're going to start the program again. We're going to do what we did last time. We're going to add, and we're going to add a new one, a new at new.com, and we're going to add this, be calling it new, and we will accept. It then will update, and now we're going to see here we have our first user is Dan. Our second user is test.com. Our third user is a new one, ABC, okay. And then our next one is N, which is 5. And then this next one over here is new at new.com, and it will have an ID of 6. So in fact, now this is not really a good test. I thought it was a good test. It's not a good test. Why? Why isn't it a good test? We'll let it run to the end here. But why isn't it a new test? Because we didn't delete this record out like we should have, so that it will skip a beat here, so that the record, so that our fake ID and our real ID are not the same thing. So we're going to delete this record out, and we'll exit. We'll come back in, and now our fake ID and our real ID are not going to be the same thing. So here we're going to come in, and let's delete that record as well, and exit out. Come back in, and now we're going to add a record, and the record will have a record of new at new.com, and we're just going to call this new. And one of the things I want to show you, so before we do anything, let's go back over to form code, and right before we insert, so right before we update, I want to look at my user. So right before we add it, I want to look at my user. Okay, so now I say accept. Now my user right now has like a 0 ID, and then after it gets back from the add, so we'll go through the add, and it will assign an ID equal to the fake ID. So now this user ID that it has will be 4. Okay. And so now it's 4, right? But now, once it goes through the update process, and we will put this in the update process. So once we go through the update process, my user ID is still 4. That's because even though the my user ID is still 4, so even though it's been changed in the database and it's been changed in the data set, it hasn't been changed in the combo box. So I'm going to run it through to here. And now we have a U. The first U is going to be 1 in Dan. The second U is going to be 2 in test. The third U is going to be 3 and new 1. And the fourth U, now this is the one that we care about, is new and new at new.com. But look what happened to our ID. The ID now matches what's in the database. So this whole process has allowed us to sync up what's in the database with what's in the data set with what's in the combo box. Now we can continue on this process, select the record that we just added, and change that to new.edu. When we changed this at the beginning of this video, remember what happened? We got a concurrency violation. But now it works just fine. So now we will exit from this program. We'll go back in. We'll just make sure that new is new.edu, which is what we thought it was going to be. And so we've solved this. And the way we solve this is by creating a stored procedure. So, wow, it's been a very long process getting through all of this, hasn't it? But hopefully you've seen how to create an end to your program, and you've seen some other little things along the way, in particular in this last video, how to use stored procedures.